Hello folks, as the New Year holiday comes ever closer, we're not just at the end of the year, but also at the end of the War Within expansion. So I thought I'd expand my usual review of the year into a review of the War Within's entire expansion. So let's dive in. For me personally, the Battle for Azeroth's War of Thorns 3-episode storyline was the high watermark of expansion pre-patch events. Ever since, frankly, I have felt like the events have been regressing, and this sadly was a trend that was to continue with the War Within, with the initial launch of an event that was so poorly received that within a matter of days, the Blizzard developers completely reworked both the event itself and its rewards. Yes, they really did that. I've no idea what happened inside Blizzard for this to happen, but it's hard to believe that anyone on the dev team would have thought that this was in any way a good way to introduce a new expansion. The resulting event was for me, at best, merely okay. A series of 4 open world event mini scenarios which rotated around every 15 minutes. As a way to get deterministic catch-up gear thanks to a vendor, it was an okay way to use up a spare hour or so, but it didn't for me do very much to set up the new expansion. Weirdly, the rewards also included an heirloom ring, which could have been quite appealing, except that it came on top of some very significant nerfs for heirlooms overall. So much so that in the War Within, hardly anyone noticed when the developers very quietly forgot to release their usual upgrade for heirlooms to make them scale up to the expansion's maximum level. Of course, the real reason for a pre-patch is to introduce the expansion's major system changes separately from the main content to give them a chance to bed in. And this time around, the biggest addition was warbands. Billed as account-wide everything, this brought a revamped login screen, account-wide currency transfers, a new warbound gear status allowing us to transfer more gear between our characters, and the biggest feature of all, the new warband bank. Playing alts has over the years become very deeply embedded into the World of Warcraft community, and demands for more alt friendliness and sharing status across accounts has been coming from the player base since well before even Legion. And I don't think that it's unfair to say that the dev team have been lagging behind the player base. So much so that game director Ian Hasse-Costas implicitly admitted in a game dev presentation that things like the Legion artifact system and Shadowlands Covenant lock-in were at least in part attempts by the developers to try to make us become more attached to playing a single character. Shadowlands, of course, was a massive wake-up call for the developers, forcing upon them, whether they liked it or not, major changes in philosophy. And ever since Dragonflight, we have been seeing more and more alt-friendly features. So warbands, in many ways, was taking that to its logical conclusion. And what a conclusion! In my opinion, the developers, for the most part, have fully embraced the account-wide everything mantra. Sure, there have been some occasional very strange decisions. For example, why on earth are Legion Order resources in Ancient Mana still character locked? It's a complete mystery to me. But overall, the developers do seem to be making a good faith effort to make as much as they possibly can truly account-wide. That wasn't to say that the new feature had a smooth landing, with what was by far its most important feature, the warband bank, disabled even before the pre-patch went live, only to finally be restored a week into that patch. And the currency transfer feature has had, over the lifetime of the expansion, multiple full or partial temporary shutdowns. Now, of course, pre-patch events are pretty short-lived, and it wasn't long until we were dropped into the expansion proper, with the player base being split into early and delayed access. More on that in a moment. The start of a brand new expansion has always been the absolute highlight for the whole expansion cycle. I just love being able to dive into exploring all of the new zones and questing content, and the developers have never put a foot wrong here in the near 20 years, as it was at the time that the War Within expansion released. And indeed, that expansion has turned out to be no exception to that rule. The initial introductory scenario was, like most of these, decent the first time through, but was to later on become a bit tedious to repeat on alts. However, it did culminate with Xal'atath's first real appearance in-game for the new expansion. And what an appearance! Voice actor Claudia Christensen of Babylon 5 fame delivered a Xal'atath full of purring menace and sensual joy. The first zone of the expansion, Isle of Dawn's questlines were superbly paced, keeping me moving along at a very good pace, with a fairly decent ending. The next zone, the Ringing Deeps, wasn't quite as well paced, leading for much of the zone to a fairly average experience. Of course, an average leveling zone experience in World of Warcraft is for me still among the best RPG gaming experiences out there. And then we hit the climactic cinematic of the Ringing Deeps campaign. Hearing the World Soul Azeroth's voice for the first time needed to be a big deal, and it was. Azeroth's direct intervention to save the Earthen from population extinction raised the hairs on the back of my neck, but did nothing to prepare me for Magni's fate. Reduced to a burned out husk by being the conduit for Azeroth's full power, Magni's fate was superbly handled and delivered the level of emotional gut punch that I've only ever experienced from Legion's Suramar storyline, which until now had been the crowning glory of WoW's in-game storytelling. And yet the story wasn't done yet. If there was any question if Azeroth was going to be set up to be like the other cosmic powers of the World of Warcraft universe, that is, as an indifferent entity only really interested in our fate when we can be of use to them, it was immediately dispelled as Azeroth again intervened, not just to restore Magni, but to release him from many years of serving her as Diamond Man. It's not often a video game can bring a tear to my eye, but this certainly did it. That outstanding ending was always going to be a very tall order for the remaining storylines to live up to, but Hallerfall was determined to do its best to try. If, like me, you also did the side quests, you were presented with a spooky zone where the darkness really did have things to be afraid of, and an environment which took visual world building in World of Warcraft to a brand new level. The main story wasn't quite so exciting, focusing more on Anduin and Faerun as they tried to head off a Void-led rebellion. But it still offered a very good ending, with an exciting battle as we took the fight directly to the Nerubians. That battle continued into the start of the Ashkahet story, with an exciting flying ship assault into the zone, only to fall victim to a Nerubian trap. Following an overly rushed introduction to the Haranir Arena, it was on to the Nerubian resistance leader, the Weaver, a giant spider who was played with sinister glee. The overall story experience was mixed though. The process of recruiting the Weaver's co-conspirators was quite enjoyable for me, but was also heavily padded, and at times I think the story did struggle to stay on track. That was though until we reached the climactic end cinematic. A face-off between Illyria and Xal'atath offered up another opportunity for the best World of Warcraft villain since the Lich King to show her mettle. And show it she did. Where the end of the Ringing Deep was an emotional gut punch, this was, in contrast, exciting and again very sensual. When all taken together, quite simply, this was the best start to a World of Warcraft expansion that we've ever enjoyed, delivering 2 full-scale zones which arguably managed to surpass the incredibly high bar set back in Legion by Suramar, and the 2 remaining zones being not much behind the best the game has had to offer in the past. Now, Blizzard have had a long history of ruining the max level campaigns by time gating them to destruction. Thankfully though, while unnecessary time gating was still a part of the offering, it was much reduced, with the story being told over 3 much larger episodes than usual. The first 2 episodes, while okay, did to me feel a little bit like padding, but the final episode, where we again faced off against Xal'atath, discovering that the Nerubian attack was merely just a feint to draw us to Khazal-Gar, and the core way in order to power up Xal'atath's Dark Heart, again delivered in terms of quality and enjoyment. Now, World of Warcraft though is a lot more than just leveling and storyline, and moving on to the max level content, we had a major change to the formula with a delay in the opening up of Mythic Zero dungeons until the raid opened up. I think that this decision did have a bit of a mixed response, with high level players feeling like they had little to do, but for me as a more mainstream player, it offered me the time and space that I wanted to explore what the rest of the World of Warcraft had to offer. Put simply, for me, the World of Warcraft had the best start to a World of Warcraft expansion ever, and for a few short days, the impossible dream of a Legion 2.0 expansion seemed a real possibility. While the World of Warcraft team's decision to offer a paid early access was controversial, the dev team did do an excellent job of ensuring that folks whose access was delayed didn't really fall behind. But nevertheless, its mere existence did still leave a very bad taste in the mouth for the majority of the player base. That day one early access experience was very stable and largely bug free. And put simply, it is very clear that World of Warcraft was ready to release on day one of early access. And that simply demonstrates that in reality, this was not early access, it was delayed access for the people who did not pay up for the top package of the expansion. Moving now into Season 1 of The War Within, and the new raid was for me pretty enjoyable, with interesting fights, but an understandably samey interior. My one disappointment though was that it was reduced in size to only 8 bosses. The last time we've had a raid that small was Aldir back in Battle for Azeroth. But it was when we looked beyond the raid that the cracks started to show in the new expansion. In what, in my opinion, was a botched attempt by the developers to try and reduce the difficulty gap between mainstream Mythic Plus and the Mythic Raid, the difficulty jumps between the various Mythic Plus levels were significantly increased, and this was further exacerbated by a reworked affix system which included Challenger's Peril, which from +7 massively increased the penalty for player deaths. That latter was a terrible introduction, which led to increased quitting and toxicity in Mythic Plus pugs, and I to this day remain at a complete loss to understand what the developers were thinking of by putting it in the game. And for Mythic Plus players looking to progress further, there was worse to come, with Tyrannical and Fortified doubling up at +10, widening an already overly large gap between +10s and +9s, and then Xanathar Scale at +12 with yet another widening. The end result was to create a situation where groups could manage to +2 a particular key level, but then be unable to even complete the next level up. On top of this, many of the dungeons were extremely punishing for healers and especially tanks, and no more so than in the absolutely dreadful Grim Batol dungeon, which in the Mythic Plus season quite simply had no redeeming features at all. This very quickly turned into the worst Mythic Plus season ever, with huge pushback from players at all levels, even the highest of level players, forcing Blizzard into massive buffs to reward progression in order to try and unblock players and get them progressing. The end result of this was that very sadly that initial hope for the War Within to at least match Legion was very quickly crushed. That said, for less performance oriented players, things were actually on the up. The new Delve feature, which offers a solo-friendly alternative to Mythic Plus for progression, turned out to have a little bit of a rocky start, where in my view a lack of sufficient testing caused huge imbalances between solo and group difficulties, which Blizzard responded to initially by overtuning it for everyone. This of course was not tenable at all, and by the end of week 1, Delves had been hugely nerfed, probably a lot more than Blizzard would have liked. However, this turned out to be the saving grace of the new feature, allowing it to offer a level of long-term progression that solo and casual players have very long been denied in the game. Delves managed to deliver what previous attempts like Torghast and Island Expositions completely failed to do, and that was a successful alternative to the big three. While solo and casual players tend not to be very well represented in World of Warcraft discourse online, even today as the War Within comes to an end, I still see plenty of players hanging out at the entrances to Delves, clearly demonstrating that they still remain very popular. For the rest of the open world content though, this is an area which in my opinion has been regressing continually since Battle for Azeroth, and sadly for me this was to remain the case in the War Within, often with only 3 new world quests a day, bolstered by open world events which only really worked out as a once a week activity. The open world felt to me more like a busy weekly chore, with very little to do outside of reset day. And that feeling was exacerbated by those weekly open world events not really landing for me. Theatre Troop, in my opinion, lacked the depth or excitement of the Dragonflight events. An Awakening of machine, which went through a ton of iteration in the beta, nevertheless ended up feeling like a dull and repetitive experiment gone wrong. Hallowfall Spreading the Light did have a lot more potential, but again, due to the main bonus events being the same every week, Elite never managed to deliver on that potential. In contrast, Ashkahet's combination of a weekly choice between 3 of our allies and a new Rumours and Treasures system did manage to offer a bit of a fresh take in quest mechanics, and was pretty decent gameplay wise. Sadly though, this was badly let down by poor reward design, with the little mini activities rewarding only a tiny dribble of currency and not even any reputational progress, meaning that even though I personally enjoyed doing them enough to play them for quite a while, they always kind of felt a bit like I was wasting my time by doing so. So overall, the start of the War Within for me can be summed up as a bit of a disappointing mixed bag. Next up was patch 10.0.5 in World of Warcraft's 20th anniversary. As of any major date, this got a whole patch of its own, with a completely revamped anniversary event area with a fairground theme and some cool new activities to try, new world bosses, and a brand new raid. And it was topped off with the introduction of classic time walking and a heavily promoted new scenario led by Chromie. Taken individually, the new activities all felt pretty new and fresh to me, with the exception of that Chromie scenario. Based in Blizzard marketing, I had hoped for a cool open world event in Silithus, but instead we got a running on rails, fight stuff and kill a final boss scenario that in my opinion lacked any depth to justify being in a scenario wrapper. The biggest issue though with the anniversary event was that the event activities never really felt like they came together into a coherent whole. A major reason for this was that the rewards mainly came from weekly or daily wrapper quests, with most of the activities not rewarding anything directly, kind of repeating the same design error as we saw in Ashkahet. The next patch, 11.07, therefore, did have some heavy lifting to do with a brand new zone, Siren's Isle. This was apparently a previously unused Battle for Azeroth Island expedition map, and the gameplay was heavily based on the Timeless Isle format of rares and treasures, along with a new borrowed power ring to progress. That ring was to prove controversial, thanks to Blizzard's plans to timegate it. However, following a backlash, the developers did relent and allow us to get most but not all of the power up front. Sadly though, that power acquisition was then blighted by annoying bugs, which were left to persist over the Christmas break. Looking beyond the issues with the ring, and the zone's gameplay itself did have a few interesting ideas, but overall it never really came together for me into a coherent whole. I did have a decent time farming out a couple of the mounts, but beyond that there really wasn't much reason to go back, except for those weekly chore quests. This of course did take us up to the end of 2024, and the announcement of the next major new zone, Undermine. A major patch based in goblins was for sure a very risky move on the part of the developers, but it presented a challenge that they for sure managed to rise to, delivering a quirky and very different but ultimately fun experience. The main factor in the new zone's success was its vibe, one that mirrored the equally successful Mechagon. Story-wise, following Owena's investigation into the old god Black Blood into a lost goblin city only to encounter an ethereal conspiracy to repair Xal'atath's dark heart, which ended with the ethereals betraying Xal'atath and Xal'atath throwing her then champion Galliwick to our tender mercies, felt a little bit like narrative whiplash, but it was nevertheless well paced to play through and bolstered by some outstandingly good side quests into an overall decent experience. Even Blizzard's inevitable attempt to add unnecessary time gating failed to dampen proceedings. The new raid was outstandingly good, especially in vibe and visuals, and I to this day regret that the interior of the Galagio was not also opened up for open world play. But again, this raid was disappointingly small, with only 8 bosses, turning out to be the smallest for a mid-season raid that we've seen in the modern era. Learning from the mistakes of Season 1, Blizzard overhauled Mythic Plus with significant reductions in difficulty and the effective removal of Challenger's Peril. This combined with the Season 1 gear reward buffs to offer a very satisfying season, and the mid-season introduction of Turbo Boost, an increase in the gear upgrade cap, along with trinket and weapon vendors, which happened to coincide with the removal of the usual crest caps, felt incredibly good. For more casual players, the success of Delves was to continue with the launch of 2 brand new Delves, including the outstanding Side Street Sluice, which to my mind is an exemplar of how to build an awesome instance gameplay experience. And the open world experience, while still over-reliant on those annoying weekly quests, did still offer up some unique gameplay mechanics, and ended up being one of the very few times in World of Warcraft that I have enjoyed farming rares. That latter was largely due to a reward mechanic that felt worth chasing, but optional at the same time. One smaller addition to the Undermine patch was to the warband feature. Right from the very introduction of the new login page's campfire scenes, players had been asking for customization options. And for me, the original Dragonflight inspired scene was by that point starting to get a bit old. So the introduction of multiple new campfire scenes for us to earn and choose between was super welcome. Given the success of Undermine, there were high expectations for patch 11.15, especially as the equivalent Dragonflight patch 10.15 had been such a massive success thanks to its awesome Time Rift feature. And on paper, with a new Time Rift inspired open world event, the return of horrific visions, and a version that avoided the feeling of forced content that the original BFA outing had offered, and a new Dastardly Duels encounter that many thought sounded like a possible Brawlers Guild 2.0, a lot of us were expecting it to deliver. Sadly though, that was not to be. An experiment on the part of the developers to spread the features out over time really didn't go down well with the player base, due in part to excitement around horrific visions, but also a near complete failure of the open world event. Simply put, the Nightfall event was released in a completely broken state, with bosses that would not spawn, many objectives that were broken, and a ton of other issues. In the past, a broken feature would be mitigated by having lots of other content to do, but with that content not yet available to play, this event had to stand on its own 2 legs, and those were legs that, due to Blizzard's lack of proper quality control, had been kneecapped, leaving them of absolutely no use whatsoever. This release now stands alongside the Dragonflight Hearthstone crossover event as one of the worst releases the dev team have ever offered for the game. And it was bad enough that game director Ian Hazzikostas, in response to being challenged by print media journalists, had to acknowledge that they had let the player base down. Those issues were quickly fixed, but for many of us the damage was already done. And for those of us who did stick around and try out the new working event, it turned out to be a huge disappointment. Unlike Time Rift, 6 rotating bosses and a deep pool of events, this new imitation felt incredibly shallow, with just 2 possible bosses and a relatively limited set of objectives, several of which were unable to cope with the number of players in the area. To add insult to injury, a rotating set of 6 quests of 3 per day felt very much like they had been cut and paste, with every single one of the quests offering exactly the same fill the bar, kill stuff and click mechanic, with only really the location they took place in changing. Systems wise, we got the launch of the new cooldown manager, a built-in version of those popular weak aura based head-up displays. This should have been a major upgrade to the game's user interface. Should. Instead, in my opinion, it was released in an unfinished state, with numerous missing trackers and other questionable decisions by the developer, who reacted to player feedback and testing with defensive dismissal. And to top it all off, the feature had absolutely no customization options whatsoever. Small wonder though that it was immediately dismissed by the majority of the player base. Moving on to horrific visions, and while it was still to be just the same 2 rotating scenarios of Stormwind and Orgrimmar, thanks to some major improvements to rewards and an extended mass system, it did manage to deliver a pretty decent experience. albeit one that was let down a little bit by Blizzard's decision to exacerbate its time-gated launch with further unnecessary internal time gating of its progression. In BFA, I was not a fan of the visions, in part due to their oppressive design, but mainly due to a feeling of being forced to do them in order to progress my cloak. With that latter problem removed, it was a far better experience, albeit one that was slightly harmed by a lack of difficulty balancing between the two versions. And finally, there was Dastardly Duels, a 1 to 5 player boss only encounter. On the PTR, this had felt fast-paced and anarchic, and I was predicting that it would be very successful. Sadly though, at launch, it had been significantly tuned up in difficulty, slowing it down a lot, and this was definitely to its detriment, leading to encounters that felt slow and mechanically uninteresting. And that uninteresting feeling was further exacerbated by its reward design, with time-gated weekly quests, which trickled out the rewards in a fixed order. The end result was to turn it into a weekly chore to do for those rewards. Small wonder then that it had a pretty negative response. Patch 11.17 brought us a new story campaign, where despite her people being attacked via the 11.15 event by Nerubian invaders, Siren decided to find herself by heading off to an ancestral homeland in Arathi, landing right into brewing hostilities that were being stirred up by the antagonist from a previous short story, one Maren Trollbane. In what was essentially a retread of that short story, we uncovered a conspiracy and put down the rebellion, only for Daneth Trollbane to decide that simply banishing the leader of the uprising, his niece Maren, will for sure make sure that she doesn't just go off and stir up trouble for a third time. This patch also brought a brand new feature called lore walking, which allowed us a new way to recap old stories and character art. This was a really good idea that had the potential to enhance how the game delivered its story, but sadly it was very badly let down by far too many game-breaking bugs. We also saw the introduction of the combat assistant, a built-in alternative to popular rotational helpers like Hakili, but one that had a new trick up his sleeve. The one-button assistant could turn the combat assistant's recommendations into a single button to press, mimicking complex macros of the past and offering us new ways for very casual and even new players to experience the game. I personally have some very mixed feelings about this feature. On one hand, it is great for accessibility, but on the other hand, a lack of support for cooldowns, tanking and healing means that it's really not great for teaching players how to play, which is the usual justification for having such a tool. Borrowed Power also made its return with a brand new Titan Disc belt, which was earned and powered up via delves. This was a lot better than its predecessors, albeit I have to say I'm still not a fan of adding systems like this into the game. Continuing the trend of patch 11.15 of scheduled events, we also got a fresh outing of Turbulent Timeways, which was accompanied by the belated launch of Battle for Azeroth Time Walking, and the option to at long last obtain the best mount that never was, Time Captain Hooktail from Tazavesh. And this was quickly followed up with the return of the Diablo-themed Greedy Emissary event and a brand new feature called Collector's Bounty. Overall for me, patch 11.17 was the better of the two mid-season 2 patches, and a major improvement in Dragonflight 11.07's Dreams Sword patch. But after all of that, it's time to head into the final major patch, 11.20. Story-wise, we were off to Koresh, the ruined homeworld of the Ethereals, where we had to team up with a surprising ally, Xal'atath. Now I have to say, being on the same side as Xal'atath was just as much fun as being her enemy. Be it in the quest dialogues or voice-acted NPC lines or the cinematics, Xal'atath was at her sinister and sarcastic best. One moment buttering us up as she tried to win us over, only to turn on us the next. While her mortal enemy Alira, forced by circumstances to join in, left no opportunity unturned to express her horror at what was going on. When I did this campaign story on the PTR, it was outstandingly good, easily surpassing the best we've seen in game. And while when it went live it still was pretty good, it was nevertheless very badly let down by two decisions by the dev team. The first of those decisions was to release the big reveal that we'd be teaming up with Xal'atath as a promotional cinematic, one that completely spoiled the story's biggest moment in an act of outright self-sabotage. And the other, of course, was our old friend time gating. While the time gated Undermine story had made a decent effort to feel like it still made sense, the time gate that was added to the Koresh storyline was abrupt and gave no indication that there would be any more, partly due to a bugged countdown bar. And the end result of that time gating was to give players who saw the story for the first time on live a vastly inferior experience to the one that we had on the PTR without that time gate. And on the subject of bugs, my day one run through of the storyline was marred by numerous game breaking bugs, which saw quests disappear from the quest log or fail to complete, requiring multiple relogs in order to recover. Moving on to the max level content, and the new raid was pretty decent, but with only 8 bosses, which if I'm not mistaken is the smallest final raid in the World of Warcraft's history. The raid ended up having a very uneven progression curve, an issue that had also been a problem with the previous raids as well. After the huge success of Season 2 of Mythic Plus, Blizzard adopted very rightly a steady as she goes approach for Mythic Plus Season 3, and that was a very good thing. For delves, there was a brand new delve and some new delve mechanics, but the new delve for me honestly wasn't a massive success. Reusing the interior of the Azure Vault, as it turned out, didn't really work out well at all, thanks to a confusing and annoying layout, and for the most part throughout Season 3 I've been avoiding this delve. Thankfully though, one of the strengths of the delve format has been that we can pick and choose within some limits what delves we do, and long may that continue. I have a feeling that delves would not have been the success that they turned out to be had we been forced to do those 2 underwater delves from Season 1 throughout the entire expansion. And as for the rest of the open world content, for me this was a major disappointment. It was only 2 dumps of world quests per week. The zone for the most part feels very similar to the Siren Isle in that there's little or no reason to visit once you farm the cosmetic rewards that you want. Helping Venari in her Oasis was a system that did have enormous potential, but with the quests from it again only being available in 2 weekly dumps, combined with an unclear progression system and weak reward design. Honestly, as an aside, why this didn't have a reputation to progress, I'll really never understand. I don't think that this feature managed to land well at all. The final ending of it, where we see Venari restore the world soul of Koresh, was kinda enjoyable, but the lack of any meaningful changes to Koresh afterward did dilute its impact. And the other main mechanic of the open world of Koresh, phase diving, for me felt kinda pointless. Basically, I have to use a portal to phase into a copy of Koresh where I cannot fly, just to do a couple of world quests and complete a weekly chore questline. Honestly, I kinda feel like this patch would have benefited from the developers having focused all of their efforts on just one of those 2 mechanics, ideally Venari's Oasis, as the content overall gave me a very strong vibe of having been spread far too thin. Moving on now to patch 11.25, and it was dominated by just one big feature, Legion Remix. Building on the very popular MOP Remix format, the Legion version did have a bit of a bumpy ride during testing, but thankfully the developers did take the feedback from testing on board, massively buffing progression, add in some experimental new mechanics, including a rotating choice of ejectors for extra rewards, and a new heroic world mode, which adds extra difficulty to the open world, and the end result overall was a pretty good experience. My own personal approach to Remix is to just redo the open world campaigns and farm the mount rewards, but for the people who did engage in Remix's endgame, the broad feedback has been very positive, despite a decision to release the content in phases. I have used the term time gating quite a lot in this review, but that is a phrase that I generally reserve for cases where I feel that the content delays are artificial and harmful overall to the game, and I don't think the phasing in Legion Remix was quite so clear cut. Legion does have a lot more content than Mist of Pandaria did, and spreading out the raids over time did, I think, have a lot of merit, and I did not get the sense from my play that it harmed Remix at all. That said, at the same time, I also get a sense that Remix didn't have the same levels of player participation that MoP Remix did, and I do wonder if this is a case of the novelty of the format starting to wear off. To be sure, it was a success, but I do wonder if it may be time to bring this format to an end while it's still ahead. It's not super clear to me what other expansions could get the remix treatment. Wrath, of course, was very popular, and nostalgia would guarantee a lot of interest, but I don't think that it has enough non-raid content to carry a remix season. BFA, of course, does have enough content, but it was a very Marmite expansion, loved by some and loathed by many others. But that's by the by. Patch 11.2.5 also saw updates to the cooldown manager, including the addition of much needed customization and the addition of a lot more abilities. In my opinion, this version was the version that should have been the first release of this feature. It still wasn't perfect, thanks to some remaining weird omissions. Had the player base not already dismissed this feature due to the terrible initial impression of its first launch, I think we would have seen a lot more take-up of it this time around. And finally, this patch also brought the start of Season 3's Turbo Boost, with the reward tracks again being raised, but all of the other features being delayed for a few weeks. Now, raising the reward tracks without the other changes, in my opinion, was pretty pointless, and it wasn't until the rest of Turbo Boost launched a few weeks later that it really got going. Now, to be sure, that early start didn't ultimately harm Turbo Boost, and getting up to speed in the rewards has still been very satisfying, but it nevertheless was a very strange decision for the developers to make. And with that, we get on to the final patch of 11.2.7, and of course, player housing. Player housing is a feature that a portion of the player base have been asking for years, and since its announcement at the end of last year, it had been much anticipated. Despite being probably the most technically complex new feature ever released in a mid-expansion patch, it has turned into a major success. Thanks to a simple but intuitive user interface and a surprisingly generous set of starter decoration to play with, it has opened up a new world of creativity in 3D modelling to players of all levels of artistic skill, including those like me for whom those skills are non-existent. Now, of course, it hasn't been perfect. Technical limitations has meant that the restrictions in outdoor garden customization have felt too restrictive for many players' tastes, and the requirement to buy multiple copies of items such as chairs, while perfectly normal for this kind of game system, has felt a bit un-World of Warcraft-like for the modern player base. This though was just early access, and with more expansion to the feature expected in midnight, I'm very much looking forward to see where it goes. Beyond housing, and we got the final story beat of the expansion, introducing Alenia's sister Vanessa Windrunner and her son Arator, who are to be the co-protagonists of Midnight. It follows Arator's abortive attempt to recruit Illyria and even Sylvanas in a surprise visit to the Maw, to our cause of stopping Xal'atath, and culminated in Xal'atath seemingly opening a portal from her realm into ours. Bringing Sylvanas and the Maw into the storyline was a very gutsy and risky move on the part of the developers, but it is one that they pulled off very well, albeit I personally found the fate of Xal'atath's dark heart a little bit unsatisfying. That new campaign was accompanied by a new lore walking episode recapping some of Silvermoon's past threats and a thankfully bug-free experience, very much proving the potential of this feature. New players get a revamped leveling experience with a lightly changed exiled reach and a streamlined dragonflight, which finally incorporates previously max level storylines rather than abandoning that story in an unfinished state, as has been the norm for most World of Warcraft leveling experiences since Burning Crusade. And this was accompanied by a new recap mode for the War Within. That latter zooms us through the War Within storyline at warp speed. For players wanting a catch-up, it is pretty good, but it is so fast that for new leveling players, they will spend the vast majority of their time in Dragonflight. Now, Dragonflight's leveling is of course pretty okay, but it's very weird to me that with Midnight being the second episode of a 3-part saga, Dragonflight is getting so much more time for new players than did the World Soul Saga's first episode. For returning players, there's also a brand new starting questline in the Arathi Basin to help them get used to their characters and the changes in modern gameplay before porting them to a level appropriate content location. This is another really good idea, but like Lore Walking's first outing, it was basically broken when I did it in day 3 of the new patch, with all but one of the quests disappearing from my quest log as soon as I picked it up. I'm genuinely at a loss to understand how content aimed at returning players could be launched in such a broken state. Unlike existing players who might power through such issues, a returning player who's likely unsure if WoW is even for them these days is far more likely to just Alt F4 and cancel their sub immediately. On top of all of that storyline, we did also get the introduction of Shadowlands Time Walking, bringing us up to date with Time Walking introductions, and of course the inevitable return of the Turbulent Timeways event. And that brings us right up to the very end of the World of Warcraft expansion, which means the very obvious question is, how was it overall? And for me, the answer is that it was very much a mixed experience. It did for sure have the best ever start to any expansion ever. The development team seriously have upped their game when it comes to storyline and questline experience execution, and that was not just limited to the initial level up, but also to the max level major patch stories. That said, the overarching narrative itself was a bit ropey after that great start. The overall character arc of Rowena barely managed to get going before it was very abruptly dropped without any explanation, and I personally found Xal'atath turning to goblins to fix a broken magic artifact to be very implausible, especially when the end result was to allow Gallywix to lose it to an ethereal. And while being able to work alongside it was a ton of fun, a willingness to just let bygones be bygones and do that again just really didn't make any sense to me. And when we look at the storylines in the minor patches, the attack by the Nerubians on Hallerfall after we defeated them and presumably handed over the reins to the Weaver completely came out of the blue, and Faerun's trip to the Arathi just to deal with some Alliance versus Horde aggro really did nothing to move our character on. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the gameplay experience of doing the quests and the stories a lot, but the narrative's failure to deliver or even just advance any major story threads after that excellent start, for me, makes a lot of the expansion storylines feel like a bit of a major wasted opportunity. The gameplay for me was also a bit of a roller coaster, with a rough start to Mythic Plus before turning into some of the best progression I've ever had in Seasons. And while the raids were very enjoyable, I cannot help but notice the very significant reductions in the number of bosses. I don't really know what's going on with raiding, but the term shrinkflation very much comes to mind. The open world experience though at max level was overall very disappointing. There was plenty of individual areas of innovation and some very great ideas, be it shipping and handling or the rumour system in Ashkahet, but when I compare it to the heights of Legion and BFA, where even if you logged in multiple times a day, there was always something new to do, the open world overall felt very lacking, and no more so than when I looked at the world quest, where even right at the end of the expansion, when we have all the content in place, it's still possible to log in to just 3 world quests, along with being unable to unlock special assignments due to that aforementioned lack of world quests to do. In my view, the open world events and other activities didn't really manage to fill the gap, largely because they were very clearly designed to be done only once a week. And that combined with weekly wrapper quests, several of which are nothing more than quests to do other quests, does lead to a lot of the open world content currently feeling like nothing more than a set of weekly chores, instead of being side content that one can dip into anytime we want. While that feeling of a lack of content is offset to a degree by the faster patch release cadence, the ratio of hits to misses in the patch is probably not where either we players or the developers would like it to be. And while I have been hearing a lot of people argue that this is due to the release cadence just being too fast, past, I personally don't agree. For me, the real issue is around scope control. I think that the dev team, especially post patch 11.10, have been trying to put far too much into the minor patches, the end result of which has been to spread both the content and themselves far too thinly, something which has ultimately resulted in that content feeling a bit too shallow and rushed. As an example, I do wonder what the Nightfall event could have been if the time and effort that was spent by encounter designers on dastardly duels and horrific visions had instead been ploughed into adding a lot more polish to Nightfall instead. And if I have one bit of feedback for the developers, this would be it. The open world experience in World of Warcraft is now in need of a lot more design attention, especially when it comes to the overall gameplay loop. While those quests to go off and do other quest content do make sense as a one-off breadcrumb to introduce us to the existence of content, when it is used as a repeatable quest to do other quests, at best it adds nothing to the gameplay experience, and at worst it ends up turning that content into a chore. And speaking bluntly, it is a very lazy way to place rewards. I know that developers work very hard, but working hard is not the same as working smart. And no matter how hard the devs who work in the open world have been working, with the exception of Undermine, that effort sadly has not come through into the game's open world content in the War Within. There is a lot of individual elements which do show genuine innovation, but without a stronger overarching gameplay loop, they are not really being given the opportunity to shine. Now, this does not make the War Within a bad expansion. I've played the expansion from the start to the very end, and I have got a bunch of fun out of it. But speaking as someone whose first love has always been the open world content, that is currently the weakest element of the game, and I genuinely hope that that will change in Midnight. So where does this leave the War Within as an overall package? Well, I think it can be summed up in one word, and that word is mid. Overall, it was neither good nor bad. It was merely just okay. And that's it for my War Within review. As always, I would love to see your comments. What are your highlights and your lowlights? If you found this review helpful, entertaining, or even just plain annoying, then let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos along with my other content, then hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. If you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me in social media for updates. My links in the description as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.